Okay. Okay. Hey everybody, welcome to Red May. We're halfway through our 1-month teach-in, our vacation from capitalism. You can eat red food, wear red accessories. I have a red cast on my arm here. Or you can read red literature, Marx, or any of the great books that our people today at the panel have written. Before we get into climate crisis through the lens of a pandemic, though, I want to let you in on what's on tap for the next few days. On Friday, tomorrow at 5 p.m., we have Racial Capitalism and Disposable Populations in the Time of COVID-19. That's with Chris Chen, Idris Robinson, John Clegg, Eco Day, Sarika Chandra, and moderated by Chris Nealon. On Saturday, May 18th at 1 p.m., Border Panic and Contagion with Wendy Trevino, Malav Kanuga, Dan Denver, Harsha Walia, and Jasker and Dylan, the moderator. And on Sunday at 1 p.m., that's Pacific time, Speculative Finance, Speculative Fiction with Geoff Mann again, Charles Mudede, Steve Shaviro, Cheryl Vint, Marina Vishnet. I'll be moderating that one. Speaking about speculative finance and speculative fiction, our finances are totally speculative. We have raised so far $2,000 of our $12,000, and we've got 3 weeks to do the rest. So we depend on the kindness of strangers. And if you're feeling especially kind, if you like the things we're doing, if you want to see Red May expand from Red May Seattle to Red May Cleveland, Red May Abu Dhabi, Red May Timbuktu, and take over the world, then give us some money. Go down to the description of this event and you'll see a link. If you click on that, that'll take you where you can give a GoFundMe. You can also go to our website, www.redmayseattle.org. But now I want to turn the event over to our moderator, Assistant Professor of Philosophy at Georgetown University, Olafemi Taiwo. Femi, take it away.
All right. Thanks, Phil, for the intro. And I just want to say I've had the opportunity to do Red May Seattle a couple years back and really got a lot out of it. And it's an important, it's important to be able to have these kind of conversations. So I think it's really cool what Red May is doing. You should definitely check out the other events that are going on the rest of this month. And if you have money to give, you should definitely do so. But like Philip said, I'm at Georgetown. I do political philosophy. I'm going to be moderating today. I'm not going to say too much. I'll probably ask one question at the end, but mainly just want to get conversation going between these four. So switching to that, first we're going to hear from Thea Riofrancos, who is an assistant professor of political science at Providence College. She's also the author of a couple books that you should definitely check out. One is called Resource Radicals, From Petro-Nationalism to Post-Extractivism in Ecuador. That one is out by Duke University Press. And she's a co-author on an important book about the Green New Deal and the political possibilities for that, called A Planet to Win. That's out with Verso. And when she's not writing books, she's a member of the Democratic Socialists of America and on the steering committee of the Eco-socialist working group. So Thea, take it from here.
Thanks so much. I'm super excited about this event and a little intimidated to be the first one going, but what I'm gonna try to do in the next 10 or 15 minutes is give a vision for what I see as an eco-socialist Green New Deal, to kind of just like, what are we fighting for? And this is a vision that is very much inspired by DSA's eco-socialist work. It's also inspired by the work of Red Nation and lots of environmental justice communities across the country that have been struggling for this for a long time. So I'll first start there, and then I'll sort of offer a few pointers for how to interpret the political terrain and interpret the possibilities of winning an eco-socialist, a really radical Green New Deal in our lifetimes. So just to start with definitions. For me, and I think many of the comrades that I work with, an eco-socialist Green New Deal means first and foremost democratic control over what communities need to not only survive, but also thrive, but combined with an awareness of planetary limits and with an overarching goal of a less extractive relationship to nature. So right there, you can kind of see the distinctions between this kind of contemporary vision of eco-socialism with some more classical socialist visions that didn't take into account planetary limits and didn't offer a critique of extractivism. So that's kind of the broad view of eco-socialism. A little bit more into that, for me, eco-socialism is also about redefining what abundance means, redefining abundance away from kind of wealth and accumulation and physical objects in the world towards thinking of abundance as meaningful social relations, as care, as beauty, as public luxury, and really centering on an ongoing practice and ethic of care for both human communities and for the non-human nature in which we have relationship with. Another aspect of eco-socialism is on the kind of technological front. I know that Holly's going to get much more into this than I will, so I'm going to be very brief about it, which is that we have an understanding of green technology, whether it's solar panels or electrification of transit, as something that is necessary for a low carbon society, but as something that should be democratically controlled and not in the hands of kind of Silicon Valley, and not produced under a logic of profit, but rather one of social and natural well-being. And then the last piece that I'll say is that an eco-socialist Green New Deal is fundamentally internationalist, right? It doesn't see things as a zero-sum game between different countries, or thinking about which nation is going to lead or be like the dominant kind of force in ushering us to through an energy transition, but rather sees solidarity, internationalism, and also transnational organizing as central to how we win a Green New Deal, not only in the US, but globally. So those are kind of the four pieces that I see as central to an eco-socialist Green New Deal. I think it's clear to the folks on this panel and probably the folks listening in that we don't win this type of transformative vision through like enlightened policymakers or enlightened capitalists, but we win it through primarily bottom-up, multifaceted social struggle in the US and beyond borders, and in solidarity across those borders. We've seen a lot of the type of social struggle that we would need to win this type of radical vision over the past several years in really inspiring ways. So, first and foremost, we've seen direct action on the part of indigenous communities and environmental allies against the Dakota Access Pipeline, the Keystone and Coastal GasLink pipelines, ongoing struggles today. And we've also seen in a sort of different set of arenas, a historic strike wave over the past year on the part of nurses and teachers and other people in the care work and service economy, which, since I kind of centered care work in thinking about what a Green New Deal is, I think that's like very essential to winning a Green New Deal, is the militancy of those sectors of the labor movement. We've seen a huge expansion in DSA. So, for the first time in my lifetime, a real kind of explicit socialist and formed kind of ideological force on the left. And then we also have the ongoing expansion and radicalization of the youth climate movement, primarily through Sunrise, but also in a lot of other organizations as well. I would add to that, and this, depending on one's perspective, could be a more controversial point, I'm not sure, but I think like the volunteer base of the Bernie campaign is also really important to think through, that, millions of people were involved in volunteering for a presidential campaign that was not only explicitly democratic socialist, but was also had the most left-wing Green New Deal proposal of within sort of like formal politics, right? Not including the DSA or Red Nation or other more radical proposals. And was, I would say, more radical than AOC Markey's like initial resolution. But right now we're at a really kind of fraught juncture, to put it mildly, right? So we have centrist consolidation that pushed Bernie out of the race, coronating a candidate with very little history of commitment to climate action, let alone more radical transformation of the type that I was talking about earlier. We live under an extremely right-wing government. And also the pandemic, the social distancing measures, and the economic devastation have made the usual forms of social protest and resistance much more difficult, if not impossible in some cases, right? So it would seem, in a best case optimistic read, we're at an impasse in our struggle for eco-socialism. But more pessimistically, or maybe more realistically, we're in an extremely challenging position with no clear way forward. So what I want to do right now, because I don't want to end on that pessimistic note, because I actually don't fully believe in that pessimistic note, though I think it's important to put on the table. I want to just give 3 points that I think are important to analyze the political and economic terrain, because I believe that sort of analysis, that kind of power mapping of what the state is doing, what capital is doing, and what social struggles are up to is important to see kind of where those points of leverage and opportunity might be, and where the sort of more dynamic and conflictual aspects of the terrain are that we can kind of insert ourselves more boldly. So the first point for me about the political economic terrain is the changing relationships between state and capital. And this is still very much evolving, and I don't know if this is something that perhaps Geoff, with his expertise, will talk about a bit more, but we're definitely seeing that capitalist accumulation is impossible without state help right now. We're in a recession and maybe become a depression, and it's one that's much more devastating than the 2008 financial crisis was. And corporations are extremely reliant on the state just for the basics of accumulation and profitability right now. So we're seeing corporations begging for bailouts and getting them. They don't have to beg really, but asking for bailouts, lobbying for bailouts, and they're getting them. On the sort of flip side of that, we also see that workers, ordinary people, the economically precarious, the 99%, are also unable to survive without the state, right? The state is to some extent nowhere near where it should be, of course, but is to some extent providing income support, unemployment benefits, and other forms of economic support to ordinary people who, without a job in a capitalist society, are unable to survive, right? Because survival is commodified, and since the capitalist economy is not working as it normally does, workers and just people in general are turning to the state for support. So what all of that means is that the state, and specifically aspects of the state like Congress and the budgetary kind of process, are themselves like very salient arenas of class conflict, because we have both the state and workers, in a sense, confronting themselves in a mediated way on the terrain of the state. And this is obviously in an extremely asymmetric terrain, and capital is of course winning this kind of class war right now. The latest bailouts have been way tilted towards the needs and desires of capital, and even of certain sectors within capital. But at the same time that capital is winning, there's still an open conflict taking place, and there is increasing space, that I'm seeing at least, for more radical demands, right? Things like cancel rent, a utilities moratorium, UBI, are becoming like ordinary parts of the political discourse. And then, of course, the needed revalorization of essential work and essential workers is something that is now part of the political discourse. I don't want to make it seem that capital and workers confront each other equally, but I think capital is winning. But I do think that there's an ongoing conflict, and some more radical demands are getting into the conversation. So I think that the way to think about this is that we're at this very critical juncture right now. A lot hinges on what different actors in the state do, more so than it usually might. And the 2 paths, to simplify dramatically, the 2 paths I see forward are, we can basically do what we did in 2009, or the government can do what it did in 2009, which is double down on a fossil fueled, extremely unequal, extremely precarious for ordinary people, and highly financialized economic system. So like worse of the same. That's what happened in the sort of recovery in 2009. We increased the fracking boom. We became more unequal. The racial wealth gap increased. Ordinary people became more precarious, and the financialization of the economy increased. And that's like one road that we can continue to go down after, as the pandemic recedes and the economy begins to reactivate. Or we can make extremely bold demands, be extremely creative with our tactics, and things that I think we're already doing, we on the broader left and sort of social justice movements, and say that like that is not sustainable economically, environmentally, politically, in any way. And we need to take this critical juncture as an opportunity to completely reimagine what our society is like, what our economy is like, right? So just understanding the fact that I think the important piece is sort of understand the fact that we are at a critical juncture, that there is a class conflict going on, and that we need to be bold in our vision, and to counter what is a very likely possibility of doubling down on sort of more of the same, and making life worse for most people in this country, and of course in the world. So that's the first piece. The second piece is I just want to go to the fossil fuel sector in particular, because they're a particularly important sector to look at in terms of the possibility of a Green New Deal. The fossil fuel sector is, of course, like the main enemy of a Green New Deal. They have the most to lose with a low carbon transition. They're extremely politically powerful, and they're the main source of the planetary crisis. That doesn't mean that other types of corporations are not responsible, but the fossil fuel industry plays an extremely big role in terms of planetary emissions. And right now, the fossil fuel sector is in complete crisis, right? They are in total free fall. Demand is plummeting. The prices are plummeting. Recently, for the first time in history, I believe, we had like negative oil prices in the US, right? So the sector is in total crisis right now. The entire thing was built on this very debt-fueled, like easy credit policies from the 2009 recovery that incentivized the shale boom and deregulation environmentally, and all these types of policies that have incentivized this very dirty fuel, this very expansion of very dirty kind of fracking of oil and gas. And it's extremely precarious because it rests on debt, really, and on these policies that have allowed it to sort of expand. And right now that whole model is in crisis. Even banks are talking about literally taking over the assets of fossil fuel companies, which is obviously something we don't want to leave to banks. I think the state should do that, under a democratic socialist regime. But point being, like, we see that the sector is in crisis. So what does this mean for the struggle against the fossil fuel industry, which is, part and parcel of the struggle for a Green New Deal? There's a lot that they have on their side right now, and Nick has written about this quite a bit. There's like the ongoing and deepening criminalization of anti-fossil fuel protest in multiple states. So new laws and ordinances that have been passed that make it harder to protest pipelines and do the types of actions that were involved in, for example, the anti-Dakota Access Pipeline struggle. So there's the criminalization of protest. There's the very real possibility that the Fed might prop up the industry in the next, as might the next round of stimulus. So the fossil fuel companies have already benefited to a large degree from the prior round of stimulus and tax breaks, even taking advantage of these small business loans, even though they're large companies. But it looks like the Senate Republicans are looking for ways to actually use the next round of stimulus to bail them out. So that's a very scary prospect. And then there's the fact that in certain states and provinces in Canada, pipeline projects have been deemed as essential and been allowed to go forward even with the sort of economic, or even with the economic lockdown measures. And then the other thing that's potentially scary is that we know that in capitalism, crisis often begets consolidation, right? So a crisis in the industry doesn't necessarily mean that everyone, all the actors, all the private firms lose. It means that the smaller firms, the more precarious, the more indebted firms no longer have access to credit, they go under, and they're bought out or merged with larger firms. And we just have a concentration of capital in the sector, which makes the sector even harder to then struggle against because they're stronger when they're more concentrated, right? And then, to think about the human cost of this all, which is that 1 million fossil fuel workers are going to be out of their jobs by the end of the year, 1 million, and without anything like a just transition for those workers, right? So that's all the negative stuff, and also the ways that the fossil fuel industry could take advantage of the current crisis. However, I do want to note, and this is my optimistic side, which is that we're increasingly seeing calls to nationalize the fossil fuel sector in order to phase it out. It would, of course, be extremely easy for the government to do this now. I do not see Trump doing this at all, so I'm not trying to be ridiculously optimistic, but and I wouldn't trust the Trump government to do it in a good way, even if they did. But the point is, I don't see this happening anytime soon in the US, but I'm glad to see that there are calls for this, and there are sort of lefty like policy people that are increasingly saying this is the only way forward. It would be really cheap to buy out these companies. They're totally worthless right now. The assets are basically stranding themselves. So we could see under a more progressive government, let's say, the nationalization through sort of equity buyouts, and then the phasing out of this industry under public control. So that, that's a possibility I don't see as very likely in the near term, but who knows in the medium to longer term. And then the third thing I want to just talk about briefly, and I know I'm running up against the edge of my time, is how COVID and the economic lockdown are actually intersecting with the climate crisis, to kind of think about just how multi-layered the crises are that we're living through. So we've seen on the positive side of the ledger that the economic lockdown measures have resulted in a historic and an unprecedented decrease in emissions. I don't actually think that's so positive in the scheme of things, because it's still not enough of a drop, anywhere near enough of a drop to be on track with even the really low targets of the Paris Agreement. So it's it's a historic drop, but the fact that historic drop is not enough just shows us that we're really not on track for decarbonization in the next decade. And I think that the other, and I'll come back to the emissions point in a moment, but I'm going to lay out a couple of more ways that the climate crisis and COVID are interacting. So one is we see a drop in emissions, but not a big enough one. The second is that on a more concrete and palpable level, these crises are going to intersect for frontline communities very soon. So we're about to enter into a really bad wildfire season. If you thought last year was bad, this year will be very bad, according to the climate scientists. We're going to enter into a bad hurricane season in the summer in the Gulf and Caribbean regions. So in a very palpable and literal sense, the same communities that are the worst affected by COVID and also by the economic devastation are going to be immediately affected by wildfires, by rising temperatures, by extreme weather events, by hurricanes, by all these things, all in a moment where our public capacity to respond is completely taxed. We have no ability for emergency responders to be responding to these things, because we are barely dealing with the crisis in front of us, right? And in addition to the fact that social distancing makes it hard to evacuate people, I mean, I won't even get into all of it to be too dystopian, but these things are going to intersect in a very literal sense, and the same communities are going to bear the brunt of them. I think that, the other thing, I want to just circle back to the emissions piece, and then I'll kind of close out my comments, which is that, right now we're seeing this historic drop in emissions, but not only is it not enough in terms of where we need to go by the sort of climate science and the Paris targets and the IPCC reports and those types of things, it's also, if things kind of, if nothing radical changes, we actually might see a big increase in emissions as the pandemic recedes and the economy recovers. First of all, just in general, when we get economic recoveries, unless there's efforts to mitigate this, emissions tend to rise very dramatically in those moments, right? This is called retaliatory emissions. It just kind of emissions bounce back, and they bounce back really intensely. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Some economists are predicting that air travel will recover pretty soon. Air travel, being one of the things that's reducing emissions is the fact that there's no air travel right now. The other thing that's really important on the sort of political front to keep in mind is that people may automakers are definitely going to tell people that public transit isn't safe, and people may very easily absorb that idea that the only way to be safe is to drive in your individual cars, that mass transit is a source of infection. So it might be, and there's already indications in this direction, that people drive even more than they do rather than taking mass transit. And then the petrochemical sector is arguing that plastics, we know that petrochemicals are a main kind of feedstock for plastics, that plastics are the only way to be sanitary. So single-use plastics might increase. And so these are the messages we're going to get from industry, from the car industry, from the petrochemical and plastics industry, and from the fossil fuel industry, that fossil fuels are important and necessary and good for people's health and important for economic recovery. So we need to think about ways to counter those messages. But I guess the thing that I will just end on here is that we can see that economic lockdown is not a decarbonization strategy, right? We need a Green New Deal. We need fundamental transformations in our energy system, in our housing system, in our transit system, in our built environment, and more fundamentally in the relationship between human and nature and at a sort of deeper level. And we're at a critical juncture where we can double down on the fossil fuel economy, or we can move forward to something else. And I'm heartened to see a lot of social struggles and social demands kind of ongoing despite the difficulties. But I think we need to keep our eye on sort of this evolving political economic context and the evolving kind of state capital relations, and think about where as socialists and eco-socialists we can kind of have leverage in that train. So I'll end it there.
Thanks a lot, Thea. A lot of big picture, good thoughts to start with. Next, we're going to hear from Nick Estes. Nick is Kulwikasa and a citizen of the Lower Brule Sioux tribe. He's an assistant professor in the American Studies Department at the University of New Mexico. Also the author of a book, which you all should check out. It's called Our History is the Future. And it's out by Verso. And it puts into historical context the indigenous-led movement to stop the Dakota Access Pipeline. So let's hear from Nick.
Hamatak Yapi, thanks for the introduction. It's really beautiful to be on this panel with a lot of people. I've read almost everyone's work here and been following it, so I really appreciate this. I'm just going to start with a meme that was circulating on Indian Facebook the other day, actually a month ago. It says, "The world is worried about work, paying bills, rent, police, and the government controlling you. Relax. You've only been Indian for 1 month." I think that's a good way to start, because I think a lot of the things that different communities are experiencing right now, especially non-Indigenous communities and communities that aren't, that are white, and settler communities, are things that Indigenous people experience on an everyday basis. And obviously, we can see that as something that's been compounded. And I would make the argument right off the bat that what we're experiencing with not just the pandemic, but also the unfolding climate crisis is that this current pandemic is a modern day Indian massacre. And so too is the climate crisis, right? There are structural, we think of Indian massacres as events, right? There's a beginning and an end, they're tragic, it's awful. But in fact, as we know with settler colonialism, there is a structure to this eventfulness, right? The pandemic itself is an event. It's something that scientists, Chinese scientists specifically, had warned the United States about months in advance. Despite what you want to think about China, the Chinese scientists have warned the United States month in advance. The United States had months to prepare. We saw it coming. We saw the numbers rise. We saw the numbers rise. We saw the numbers rise, and there was nothing to be done, right, about that. And we can think about that in terms of climate change. The science out there for global warming has been around for almost half a century, right? But Indigenous people and colonized people the world over have been saying there's been a fundamental shift in the global ecology, and it's called colonialism and it's called imperialism. So we have seen this unfold for centuries, and we've been warning people who will listen that this is coming, this is happening. So the response to COVID-19 is indicative of the response to climate change, and the fact that this particular nation, the United States, is probably not going to do nothing, and that a lot of people will die if we don't change course right now, right? And we can understand that it's not just about people getting Applebee's or people getting I think there's a Baskin Robbins that somebody was protesting in front of with an AK-47. It's actually the brunt of the deaths and destruction is going to be externalized onto Indigenous communities, as it has been throughout the history of economic crises in this country. Thea just mentioned the 2009 bailout and the fossil fuel economy, essentially drilling at the expense of Indigenous peoples to get this settler economy out of the gutter. We can look at, the 1890 Wounded Knee massacre came at the tail end of a long recession that began in the 1870s, right, with the consolidation of the frontier. And this coincides with the outbreaks and the pandemics of measles and smallpox amongst Indigenous people. And so in many ways, this is a very historic occurrence, right? And if we look more more in like a case study, like at a state like New Mexico. And, you know, Philip, God bless you, asked me whether or not we had a Republican governor, as if that mattered, right? Because we have a Democratic governor, Michelle Lujan Grissom. She's high up with, you know, she's kind of a blue dog Democrat. She's high up in the Democratic Party. She's very close with somebody like the first Native American woman, Congresswoman, Deb Haaland. This, you know, state almost top to bottom is a blue state, but yet there have been the highest rates of COVID-19 infections amongst indigenous people. And being somebody from a state of South Dakota who, you know, as you know, if you've been paying attention, is in a standoff with the tribes. She's very right wing. It's a very kind of like gesture to Trump, right? That, look, I'm going to try to open up these tribes. I'm going to try to bully them into opening up their borders because it'll soften them up for the coming Keystone XL pipeline, right? So we see these kind of two differences, and we want to say, oh, one is worse than the other. But in fact, I would say that it's actually worse here in New Mexico, despite the measures that have been taken place. So in this state, Native people make up about 11% of the population. I would say that it's slightly higher. It's vastly undercounted because that's the project of settler colonialism, is constant erasure. And the Native people make up about 50% of the deaths in the state. And the state itself has been narrating this as something like, oh, this is on the Navajo Nation, it's in the Pueblos, there's nothing we can do about it. But in fact, a lot of these cases, you know, just by sheer demographics are happening off reservation. So for example, 10% of the Navajo Nation lives here in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And the deaths as they're being counted are not being counted by race or ethnicity. In off-reservation spaces. So they're only using reservation numbers to count deaths. They're not even counting the deaths of Native people that are happening off-reservation. And just anecdotal evidence, we've been doing a lot of sort of mutual aid into the streets. Of course, you know, PPE, as much safety precautions as we can take. And I would say that the visible presence of people living on the streets has actually increased because housing is you know, in short supply. And those kind of like emergency shelters that have been made available are becoming sites of infection, from what I'm being told. So it's not just about housing, it's about adequate and safe housing that's really affecting our indigenous people in, you know, living on the streets. And so that's important to remember, that this isn't just some kind of like isolated, you know, pandemic that's happening out on the Navajo Nation. It's very tragic. But at the same time, you have to remember that 70%, almost 4 out of 5 Native people don't live on Indian reservations. And so take that into consideration and think about that when we talk about things like the stimulus and the relief packages that are going through Congress. Many of them are allocated towards reservation services, which is incredibly important. But if you think about the allocation of health services to off-reservation populations, it's 0.5% of the total health budget, healthcare allocation for Indian health services, 0.5% for 70% of the population. So if we're talking about the COVID-19 pandemic, this was already a structural crisis for Native people to begin with. Before, we didn't need a virus to come in and to expose these inequalities for us. So for example, our office is right off one of the main bus lines in the city of Albuquerque, but we're right across from one of the major hospitals, which is Presbyterian. Frequently, you know, we chose that office location because frequently our indigenous relatives, you know, go to that place for like emergency care, but then they're just like kicked out on the street, like literally in hospital gowns. And so we have to find, you know, food, we have to find clothing for them and to shelter them. And this is something that existed, you know, prior to this pandemic. And this is like downtown Albuquerque. This isn't like, you know, kind of cordoned off into some section of the city. And in fact, one of our sisters, actually a relative of one of our members, was murdered in broad daylight right in front of our office. So these are the realities that we're facing. This all happened this year, by the way. It's not like, you know, the last 2 years. This was just the months leading up to the pandemic and the shutdown. So this is important to kind of take into consideration how the state itself is responding. And Philip and I were talking earlier, and you know, Philip is like, he has this theory about the nation and the state, and it's really great. I really appreciated that. But I really was thinking about this in the sense that if we see the response, the divided response in this settler nation to the COVID-19, we can really see it as like a hallucinatory response. This overwhelming response is that somehow, you know, bleach or UV light is gonna cure it on the more extreme end. But on the other end, it's like, it's about opening up the economy, as if opening up the economy is going to save us all, right? And we understand that as indigenous people, that we know what this economy is built on. So going back to this state in New Mexico, the economy never shut down. The oil and gas economy has never shut down. So the oil and gas economy in this blue state, by the God, you know, given graces of our governor, is still operating and fully functioning, and in fact, still leasing indigenous land for $2 an acre online. And so we've confronted this challenge, because normally we go out and protest and we raise hell, but we can't, because, you know, for safety reasons. And so they're really taking advantage of this particular crisis to expand exploratory drilling in and around indigenous communities. Despite what Deb Holland says, despite what Michelle Lujan Grissom says, we have members who are on the ground right now watching oil tankers go into these isolated communities who are trying to stay on lockdown, right? But these oil workers, many of them are white, coming from reservation border towns and coming into these places uninvited, because the tribes have no authority over the roads, unlike our tribes in, you know, South Dakota, where we're more contiguous around the kind of the entry points into our reservation on the Eastern Agency, where Navajo, where much of this oil and gas extraction is happening. It's a checkerboarded region, so there's a multiple jurisdiction that happens. So there's like tribal, federal, and state, and tribes don't have jurisdiction over non-indigenous workers, so we can't kick them off even if they commit a crime. And so there's been an increase of murdered, missing indigenous women in and around this area. Prior to the pandemic, there's been an increase of infection rates, and in the meantime, the white-dominated border towns that kind of ring the Indian reservations are calling for kind of border security themselves, and they're actually called in the New Mexico National Guard to prevent indigenous people from leaving the reservation and going into a place like Gallup, New Mexico. Because if you don't know anything about the Navajo Nation's larger than the state of Texas, but only has 13 grocery stores. And I think we averaged it out the other day, and it's about one grocery store for every 1,200 people. Think about that. That's normal in the rest of the world, but in the United States, that's not normal, right? And that's not really funny, but it kind of is. So many indigenous people are dependent on traveling to these places just to get a fresh tomato, right? And so this is the reality that we have already confronted prior to going into this, prior to this pandemic. And what we're seeing the exacerbation of these kind of racial inequalities, but we would call it, colonialism, because that's what it is. So we have this hallucination-based approach, and Vijay Prashad has kind of coined this term called the Corona shock, and looking at how socialist countries throughout the world have responded to this in a very effective way, socialist countries with strong states, and how there's been a more sort of humanitarian kind of solidarity approach, versus the way that the hyper-capitalist countries like the United States have really done nothing. I mean, in all, you can like praise Cuomo or whatever, but at the end of the day, there's been nothing done. It's actually been a withdrawal of the state. And there was this, and it's so fascinating, because on one end of the kind of ideological conspiratorial perspective, you have like, oh, the state is, clamping down, 5G is giving people coronavirus. I think 5G is giving people hallucinations. I don't know what you all are thinking, but we have like right-wing militias now taking over Capitol buildings and protesting in the street. And there isn't a real, like, a solidified kind of national response. And so on one hand, we've expected kind of this strong state, and we've seen all the disaster movies. We saw Independence Day, when the United States led the charge and saved the day. We saw Jack Ryan when they overthrew the Venezuelan government and saved the world for democracy. But in fact, we're seeing a failure of the state to do anything but only exert violence against people, right? And it's actually increased the infection rates, and there's been no kind of slowing down as we can see so far. So what I want to talk about in the kind of tail end of this is to really build on what Thea was talking about, because we have been working with DSA. The DSA has adopted the Red Deal as a working document for Democratic Socialists of America. But also, I want to just make an appeal to you all who are listening to say that the Red Deal isn't an indigenous kind of document. It's not just like, oh, this is what this is the Red Deal version, or this is the indigenous version of the Green New Deal. It's actually an entirely it builds on many of the premises of the Green New Deal, but in fact, we've built on a lot of kind of international agreements that have come out of the global South. And so just to kind of build off of what Thea was saying, the principles of eco-socialism that she spelled out really came from the 2010 People's Accord. And we actually use that as the primary inspiration of this particular document, because it spells out the indigenous Andean cosmovision of vivir bien, or living well, and Pachamama, or Mother Earth, which are central to this particular agreement that happened in Cochabamba in Bolivia in 2010. So living well is not anthropocentric, as Thea said, but or solely focused on human relations. It's earth-centric, focusing on the whole, and it understands that capitalist domination over nature is fundamentally patriarchal, and that overconsumption, which is driven primarily by the first world, is not the solution, but it's the problem, right? And if all of humanity aspired to the consumption rates of the average U.S. citizen, we would need 4 Earths to sustain it, and we only have one planet, right? So just to kind of spell out some of the principles of what we're talking about, we believe in an anti-imperialist kind of international approach, and we actually have to revive the concept and the dialogue around climate debt, not just climate reparations, but climate debt. What does that actually mean? And we can answer that maybe in the Q&A. So first world, I'll just give a basic answer to that in definition. The first world countries must assume all adaptation debt related to the impacts of climate change on developing countries by providing them the means to prevent, minimize, and deal with damages arising from their excessive emissions. That also includes, for indigenous people, that includes land return. I'm just going to say that, land return. If you want to talk about the best solution to this pandemic, it's been indigenous sovereignty, our ability to protect not just our citizens, but other settler citizens as well, to prevent the cross-contamination or the spread of this particular virus. But not only that, indigenous sovereignty is the bulwark. It's the vanguard of the climate justice movement against the fossil fuel industry right now. I'm sorry, apologies for those who live in Brooklyn, but nobody in Brooklyn is on the front lines, like against the fossil fuel industry, against the tar sands industry, against the multi-headed snake pit that's emerging out of the tar sands, extending into our territory, the Lakota territory, but also moving further westward into places like Wet'suwet'en. And I want to take a little step back and to think about this particular moment, the Corona shock, Naomi Klein calls it disaster capitalism. What it tends to do, it tends to create short historical amnesia, not like long-term historical amnesia, which is the settler project itself, but it creates short-term historical amnesia. We came out of a mass revolutionary groundswell in Latin America, but also in North America in 2019, and we seem to have forgotten. Of course, there were counter-revolutionary kind of forces in play, the US-backed coup of Bolivia, as well as the attempted kind of military aggression against Iran, and now we see this using the pandemic as a way to kind of amp up military aggression against Venezuela. But even in January and in February, when the police violently raided the Wet'suwet'en camp, there were mass protests throughout Canada, so-called Canada and North America. And in effect, just in a short kind of time span of 12 days, these indigenous nations had shut down the main railways for the entire country, almost bringing it to a halt, like resulting in $500 million in losses each day. And so when Justin Trudeau was walking hand in hand with, Greta Thunberg, the kind of 16-year-old, 17, I don't know if she's 17-year-old, the young, like European face of the climate justice movement, you can't have a protest where everyone is welcome. You have to have a class enemy. And Justin Trudeau is the class enemy because he's been pushing through these pipelines. And so when these indigenous people were taking to these rail blockades, you didn't see anybody from the United States or Canada and the green movements really supporting them. There was a modicum of support, but it was really a lot of the militant labor unions that were supporting them. And so what that suggests is that the green movement in the US and Canada actually has to catch up and take its head out of its ass, because we're still going to be doing this no matter what. No matter what, if you come along or not, we're still going to be doing this. And the Red Deal was really a document that arose in the aftermath of Standing Rock, because we were trying to coalesce a vision, a comprehensive vision for not just indigenous decolonization, but like decolonization of Turtle Island in general. So right now, what we are experiencing, as Thea had just like eloquently spelled out, is a wounded dragon the fossil fuel industry is thrashing about, right? And we have to have that coup de grace and to put it to death. And we have to listen to our indigenous land defenders and our water protectors who are on the front line.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Nick. The next, we're going to hear from Geoff Mann. Geoff is the director of the Center for Global Political Economy at Simon Fraser University. He's the author of a number of books. One in particular, in the long run, we are all dead, Keynesianism, Political Economy, and Revolution. And another with Joel Wainwright, he's the co-author of Climate Leviathan, A Political Theory of Our Planetary Future. So thank you, Geoff. Looking forward to hearing from you.
Okay, can you hear me? We're good? Okay, sorry about that. I'm such a rookie with this thing. I shouldn't be a rookie after all this time. Thank you very much for having me here, and I feel really honored to be a part of this group. I was making jokes prior to this that I was sort of the middle manager accountant type in this crew, and I definitely feel like that, and so I feel very lucky to be part of this conversation. And I just wanted to I'm going to talk about something that doesn't follow exactly closely on Thea and Nick's comments, though I learned a ton from those, and so I'm going to try and connect it as much as I possibly can. But I did want to say that it's complicated to say it's good news, but hopefully, Nick, you and the others have heard that today here in BC, two very good things happened. The Chilcotin had the New Prosperity Mine squashed by the Supreme Court of Canada, which I know the thing is, it's kind of fucked up because, of course, we had to turn to the sort of ultimate colonial arbiter, which is also non-democratic, to have this happen. But this seems to be the only way that progressive things happen in Canada, at least on the extractivist front, is that we rely on these non-elected, supposedly principled arguments. But at any rate, the mine was squashed. And also the Wet'suwet'en signed a historic agreement, I think, with the BC provincial government and the federal government, one that, at least from what I can tell, many people are excited about. So two positive turns, I guess, in this kind of difficult moment. I wanted to talk today just briefly, and hopefully this will connect with other folks' thoughts and sentiments, let's say, or sensibilities at the moment. But one of the things that has been, I suppose, that I worry about the most is the conversation that I hear all the time, both in the media, but also just in my everyday conversations, with folks that I'm in touch with, either remotely or that I run into in the street. And it's this desperate, completely understandable in many ways, desperate desire to get back to normal, something called normal. And I want to try and think about it a little bit, only because it seems to me that this idea that we can get back to something, or to something regular, is a very complicated, presents a very complicated political problem, let's say, or question, insofar as I think it's fair to say that for many of us would of course identify the fact that normal before was of course disastrous for many people. But it's also the case that there is a significant portion of the population, and they tend to be the more privileged, of course, and therefore the more powerful, that are in some ways desperate for the return to normal. And so we have this kind of time in which average folks looking to get back to work, they're out of income, they're worried about their housing, they're worried about their health. They're desperate for some sort of return to something that at least provided these things, however inadequately in the past. And this moment, therefore, I think the discussion of normal kind of feels like both an opening and a closing of a door. And I guess I would say that this is also, to relate this to the topic of the panel, this is also, I think, a dynamic that works at the heart of many conversations around climate and the kinds of necessary shifts that Thea and Nick have both, and Holly will, of course, talk about, the kinds of major shifts that need to happen for us to come anywhere near close to addressing the climate problem. This looming or kind of menacing normal in the background is also always a part of that conversation. And so here we are in this moment where things feel somewhat partially suspended, let's say, and it seems like there's possibilities, Thea identified many of them, that may make for sort of the possibility of progressive politics pushing itself more into the limelight, let's say. But it's also what feels like a moment in which that window could close. And so I guess, so to return to this question of the pull of back to normal. Now, clearly the people standing on the Michigan state legislature's steps are not the majority of the people by any means. But there is a sense in which the desire for normal makes room for a much harsher version of it in return, of course. So we see that a much harsher version of normal becomes acceptable relative to the instability of the crisis, I think. And this is the kind of thing that many people are identifying in the fears of what might come out of this moment in the pandemic, of course, where we have heightened surveillance, even harsher anti-migrant sentiments and anti-migrant policies. We have a whole range of things that could unfold and be deemed by many people reasonably acceptable, precisely because they seem to solve the problem of the normal in a way that is relatively comforting, given the massive instability that we feel right now, that we experience right now, or many people experience right now. And I think that, in some ways, these fears, of course, appear entirely justifiable on the terms with which the pandemic has been managed thus far. The pandemic has largely been managed, as both Thea and Nick pointed out, kind of disastrously on the part of many states, especially the ones that, as Nick said, were sort of the hyper-capitalist versions. So insofar as those disastrous terms have been the keys through which we face the pandemic, talking about it as if it's a product of certain nations, we've shut down the borders because anybody other is a danger, it seems now. If this is the frame through which we discuss the problem, then it often will I think, risks becoming the way that we talk about the solutions. And that, I think, is really terrifying. And in that sense, I think if the pandemic thus far, at least, and of course we can't pull all the lessons out of it by any means at this point, but if the pandemic has taught us anything useful, I think, in some ways, for anticipating the political challenges that we'll face when climate change reemerges from the political shadows, not that it's of course gone away, but certainly it's dropped down the priority list. If it's taught us any lessons, I think it's not just that the same forces that have proven disastrous here and now with the pandemic, I think that also suggests that many of those same forces and institutions are likely to precipitate disaster when climate is back on the table too. And I think this has a great deal to do with the present geopolitical context. And both Thea and Nick, again, pointed toward this kind of renewed need, desperate need, I think, for an internationalism and a solidarity that reaches not just across national borders, but around the state in many cases, because the state has proven itself so often to be the problem. And in this present geopolitical context, the one that actually exists now, I think it's fair to say that existing institutions and practices of interstate cooperation, for them, international coordination is either a shit show or a pipe dream. Like, it's not going to get us anywhere where we need to go. Now, of course, the lack of coordinated response at an international level to the pandemic some might feel is not even really the issue. Instead, it's just the lack of coordination at all, at almost any scale in many, many places. Most state-led efforts, of course, this is not true everywhere, but most state-led efforts, I would say, have made it clear, I think, that public health is not the real concern, let alone something like equity or dignity or justice. It's the social order that's in question. Now here in BC, of course, I feel somewhat reluctant saying that, because here I think I'm almost reluctant to say that I do think the provincial government deserves a lot of credit for how well they have dealt with the problem here. And certainly there are instances like in Kerala where we see the state responding in admirable ways. But insofar as most of those hyper-capitalist nations and many others, let's say, have responded, it's been to put the social order, as the main question, if the unstated one in many cases. And in almost all those instances, mass death appears to be totally acceptable if it allows for the maintenance of the social order in conditions that will be adequate to the return of normal when all of this is over, whenever that could possibly be. And I think for many of the elites in power in those places, this is the great fear, that somehow the pandemic will precipitate a situation in which we come out of this in a shape that normal won't fit any longer. And that, I think, presents both great political challenges, but also great political opportunities. Because of course, like I think it's fair to say both Thea and Nick have said thus far, we need to do the work to make sure we do come out of this as much as possible in a shape that normal won't fit. But it can't be just any old different. It has to have certain, very important characteristics. And as Nick actually said much more eloquently than me, it's clear that too, in this situation, the farther right the state administration is in any of these instances, the more vindictive, racist, violent, and arrogant the imposition of this attempt to save the social order is. It's certainly no accident that Brazil, US, and much of India, for example, despite their massive differences in geopolitical power and in access to resources and in technology and all the rest of it, all three of these nations are imploding, and that's not an accident. I think the response to the climate emergency, when it eventually, I guess, takes the form that the wealthiest nations can't ignore any longer, which somehow still hasn't happened, I think that the response to the climate emergency risks having a very similar dynamic, how it unfolds. And just like now, I think when panic sets in, and it will, I believe, there is literally, as of right now, no mechanism or pattern in the existing international / transnational / global regime to which any solidarity forming moment might turn. We lack that, and constructing that, I think, is one of the key tasks, between now and the precipice, let's say. Certainly, I think it's fair to say that the UNFCCC process has proven totally inadequate on the climate front for this, and its substitutes, willingly or unwillingly, they seem to be, people turn to the G20 or Davos for all things. I can't even believe people do that. The IMF, who else? Who knows? But these are hardly repositories of kind of international solidarity, the hope for international solidarity. And in that sense, I think the climate future, when again, the pandemic has at least subsided from our attention to the extent that it is now. In that sense, the climate future could end up, I think, in what I would probably, I don't know if it's a good description, I'm going to go for it anyway, kind of in a nation state version of what Jean-Paul Sartre actually called seriality. And I apologize for pulling out the Sartre quote and all the rest of it and being all geeky academic, but this is actually a really useful one. So Sartre once was trying to, do his Sartre thing and was struggling with, modes of solidarity. And of course he wrote 5,000 pages that could have been 50 to say so. But one of the things that he was concerned about is the way in which the collective or solidaristic sensibilities had diminished in capitalist communities or societies. And he was motivated, he wrote, because one day he rode in a bus past a bus stop and he saw a series of people standing in line at the bus stop. And he said to himself, those are people doing this, they're all together doing the same thing. So there is a sort of collectiveness about that action. They're all waiting for the bus, but they're all doing it alone. And he described that experience as seriality. We're all doing the same thing, but we're doing it by ourselves. And in some senses, he described this as a sort of characteristic of modern capitalist life and modern capitalism. It's the shitty substitute for solidarity, just an aggregate of atomistic individuals. And I think that so far, I guess this is a long way of saying so far, that the response to the pandemic around the world has kind of had characteristics like this, which I think, barring substantial changes, which are of course possible, and Thea outlined many of them, barring substantial changes, climate change is likely to produce, I think, a similar situation in which we have at the global level poorly coordinated situation in which action turns out to be a product of coercion, opportunism, resistance, and panic. And I think it seems likely too that any transnational coordination between states in that kind of condition will be largely unplanned. I think states will mostly back into arrangements, either because of political economic costs of staying aloof, or through plain old imitation like we're seeing right now. And again, barring important changes, the kinds of changes that both Nick and Thea have outlined that are sort of the key objects of struggle right now, the only way out of this kind of serial experience of crisis is likely to be the abandonment of the people at the bottom, or a coercive arrangement. And in that sense, I think meaningful cooperation and solidarity and support will have to come as much or perhaps more from outside the state, at least initially, and at least insofar as the political and institutional mechanisms, and there will be many of them, I think, and there already are a plethora, will have to be initiated by non-state actors, by indigenous groups. Certainly in North America right now, as Nick said, they are absolutely leading the struggle. In fact, they are dragging the rest of us kicking and screaming to something like something better. And we got to stop kicking and screaming and start helping along. And those kinds of conversations, I think, are also extremely crucial, or I'm not sure conversations, it sounds like a mild term. Those engagements are extremely crucial too, especially beyond the realm of the state, insofar as both Thea and Nick have also described very clearly, the state, at least certainly in North America, but also elsewhere, has been captured to a significant extent. And so insofar as the conversation begins at the state, we already have fossil fuel at the table making the decisions. Why are they even at the table? We have to be at a table where they're not. And that, again, of course, poses extraordinary challenges to the sort of everyday democracy that is the only way, as both Nick and Thea have also said, is the only way this is going to take us forward. And that is the part that both thrills me, the thought of that thrills me, but also I find quite daunting, because I think the quality of the conversations that substantiate that democracy will have to be different than they are right now. I would say they're going to need to be transparent, honest. They're going to have to make room for mistakes and experiment. They can't be merely preaching to the converted, however much the sites of struggle are often antagonistic. The larger project cannot, in the end, merely be a consolidation of sides. It also has to be, especially amongst working people where political divisions are substantial, it has to be a conversation that takes the risks to not preach to the converted, not only. Of course, it's always necessary to speak to the choir too. And that, I think, is the democracy bit, and it's really daunting. And actually, in the context today, it can be quite frightening too, for many people. And that's another reason why so many are scared away. So it's a exciting and illuminating time, and also a somewhat earth-shakingly terrifying time. One in which I think many the most important questions are still to be answered, and therefore one in which I would be remiss to suggest I have answers to them before so many of those questions have been asked. We have a long way to go, and as they say, a short time to get there. So that was all I had to offer. this evening.
All right. Thank you, Geoff. And just want to remind people who are watching to feel free to contribute questions, which we'll get to in the Q&A right after this. But before the Q&A is our final speaker. Last but certainly not least is Holly Jean Buck. Holly Jean Buck is a geographer and environmental social scientist who researches equity aspects of climate technology, including gender equity, landscape transformation, and the role of emerging technologies in the Green New Deal. She's the author of After Geo-Engineering, Climate Tragedy, Repair and Restoration, which is out with Verso. And she's a research fellow at UCLA's Institute of the Environment and Sustainability and the UCLA School of Law. So Holly, thanks for coming.
Thank you, Femi. It's really an honor to be in conversation with such sharp and good people. It feels amazing. And I hope my contribution will be useful here. It's going to be a little bit different. I think on the blurb, it said that I was going to dismantle the fantasy that the unbridled accumulation called capitalism can extend its life by socio-technical fixes like geoengineering. But I'm fairly confident that none of you have that fantasy, so I'm not going to actually do that right now. I am, however, concerned that the ways that we are confronting this pandemic emergency are setting the stage for how we might confront the climate crisis, particularly in ways that will lead to sloppy and dangerous implementations of geoengineering. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, and also try to share my screen and show some graphs for this presentation. Can you all see that? Great. So I'm going to talk about what I've been thinking of as governance by curve, which sounds boring, but is actually quite morbid. And I've noticed that there's ways that a curve image with the data behind it is providing a frame or an instruction set, a kind of prescription for what type of governance is needed. And then policy gets set out in order to bring reality into conformance with the curve. So the curve is a rudimentary representation of a possible simulated future that sets events into motion. This is the curve that you see for the plan, the scenario of limiting warming to 2 degrees, one for 1.5. Looks something similar, and it's based on all these runs of integrated assessment models. And so when the IPCC, in its special report on 1.5 degrees, said that all pathways that limit warming to 1.5 use carbon dioxide removal between 100 and 1,000 gigatons over the century, they're referring to these model runs, those scenarios. And so the idea here, carbon dioxide removal would be compensating for residual emissions. So some amount of emissions continue with these net zero targets that have been set out. And then near the end of the century, the world is theoretically removing more carbon than is being emitted, so net negative. That's kind of how people are talking about the plan in some circles that I've been in. And so how do you remove carbon? I'm not going to go through all of this today in this short talk, but there's a bunch of techniques that have been discussed, and typically they're treated as a portfolio where you need all of these options, and some of them legitimize the other ones, and it's kind of a mess. So you see these curves. This is also from the IPCC's special report on 1.5 degrees. Even the ones that don't use bioenergy with carbon capture and storage or large industrial systems, inside this curve is a massive, massive land use shift that we should have questions about, not least because of what we've talked about today about the need to return land, right? But there's all these numbers floating around about land that will imaginarily be converted to forest here, or, you know, different ecosystems. We should talk about that. But my point here is that the curve hides some of that work. Bioenergy with CCS is kind of the cornerstone of a lot of these scenarios because it combines techniques that exist. Bioenergy is grown, combusted, the CO2 is separated out and stored underground. And the land demands for this in these scenarios are enormous. So lately people have been talking about direct air capture. I've heard it referred to as a land sparing technique for removing carbon directly from the atmosphere. It still needs to be transported and stored. But it's not really land sparing by my analysis because the energy cost of converting all this carbon from one sphere to another, right, is tremendous. So it implies this huge build out of renewables on top of what we already need to do. We don't need to go into the numbers today. But the main point is that hidden inside these curves is a whole infrastructure for putting carbon back underground on the scale of the existing fossil fuel industry, or perhaps larger. And all of that is expected to be built out over the course of the century, about 10,000 facilities for CCS on the order of what we have today. Today, there's about 22. So massive industrial project, but that's what's in these 2 degree scenarios. So that brings us to this other curve. This is the so-called peak shaving curve of solar geoengineering. The idea here is that there's this curve of climate change impacts. Carbon dioxide removal can be used on top of mitigation to lessen that at a point in the future, later in this century. And putting particles into the stratosphere would shave the peak off of this curve to minimize impacts as this kind of temporary intervention, although the time axis here is probably 100 to 200 years. So a very long stopgap measure. The basic idea here is that sulfate particles would be put into the upper atmosphere where they would stay for a year or two and circulate around the entire globe, forming this kind of shield of intentional pollution that reflects 1 to 2% of incoming sunlight. And so how? Probably by designing a specialized aircraft that flies in the stratosphere and carries this material. What material? Possibly sulfur dioxide, but potentially other particles that are yet to be researched that might have less impacts on ozone. Sorry if I'm racing through this. I don't know how much background knowledge to assume about these different approaches. So this is kind of the 5 to 10 minute version. So in models, this can seem better than the worst case climate change scenarios. So this is the kind of research that leads scientists, who many of whom really want to help with climate change in the way that they know how, with their tool set and their way of looking at things. They see catastrophic climate change, as climate scientists do, and then they say, oh, this one looks much more favorable, right? But obviously the ecological implications in particular haven't been well researched because, ecologists that understand complex systems aren't going to want to spend time researching something that's so crazy like blocking incoming sunlight. And so there's a lot of other negative impacts, which you can anticipate or read about. The one I'm going to mention here is the termination effect. So if a solar geoengineering intervention is begun, which is the red line in this figure, but then it's suddenly interrupted. Sorry, business as usual is the red line. The solar geoengineering is the blue that brings global mean temperature down. If it gets interrupted for whatever reason, the warming that had been suppressed will come back very rapidly within some years, which would be far more catastrophic to adapt to than the more gradual warming. So another observation I've had is that these kind of curves track really well with the mastered narrative of a lot of Western literature, going back to Aristotle's Poetics and drama. It's kind of like you have this rising action, you have this climax, and then this resolution and this falling action. And that isn't lost on, this is the final page of Shell's report about negative emissions. It positions people, including oil companies, as like the hero, because we're all at this moment of the climax in these storylines where it's our moment to, take the current or whatever heroic thing, right? And everybody, I think, might be a little bit susceptible to this because it's the form of so many of the stories that we've heard. But I don't think it's a coincidence. I think what we're doing is we are actually making science and sharing it in a form that fits with this narrative. So then there's a question of, is the science representing reality, or is it just how we want it to look because we know that form, if that makes sense. So my premise here is that trying to make reality conform to the curve is a narrative drive, but a bad idea because it's a simplistic way to govern complex systems. And so now I'm going to talk a minute about this other curve, which we know so well. So what's wrong with focusing on this curve? The first problem was that the temporality of the curve was cropped in many, including this picture, when it came out, but others, to a certain period of interest. And if you go into the modeling that these policy decisions started from, like this Imperial College report, which Trump was briefed on, and apparently this was the report that kind of flipped his perspective, you really need to be taking a longer look than just that one curve, because what happens is that you have more curves. In the UK, the curves that come after this first period of social distancing are actually taller. And so there's more to it than a curve, right? So this is, it wasn't just that he was misunderstanding the math, he was misunderstanding the temporality of the curve. And as this article in the Post pointed out, there's assumptions in some of these that make a kind of symmetry to the curve, which actually now we're living through the fact that that symmetry is not the only thing. The other thing is that there's different choices here. So this is another paper published in Science in April, and they looked at different types of social distancing interventions. But the part I want to point out is that a lot of people are thinking that, we need to really, really strict measures, but some of this modeling shows that actually you're better out with a more moderate social distancing intervention. And I encourage you to read this paper and some others I can reference. But this kind of simplistic way of looking at it isn't looking at even all the different modeling parameters we might want to think about. The other thing is that these narrow metrics that are captured, hospital capacity, deaths from the virus, include the other things we care about the totality of the response, second and third order effects. And I worry about this with both the carbon dioxide removal and the solar geoengineering too, is that the solar geoengineering looks okay if your main concern is this global mean temperature metric, but what about all these other things, right? And so the pattern in some of these modeling studies related to the pandemic is so similar to some of the modeling studies in these other fields, where you have this technical analysis, you have the plots. This is the last paragraph. No public health intervention with these kind of disruptive effects on society has been previously attempted for such a long duration. How populations and societies will respond remains unclear. It's just like, that's the kind of throwaway social part that's put in the last part, and like somebody else's job is to think about this. But what if that other person's job, whose job it is, isn't at the table? then you look at, some of the earlier guidance about social distancing, and it becomes clear that actually this hasn't been thought through. So looking at the guidance from 2007, 2017, what do they recommend? Talk to your employer, plan for the possible reduction or loss of income, consider maintaining a cash reserve. I mean, it's so far distant from what the precarious position, like who can maintain a cash reserve because the surplus goes to the capitalists. So they are really out of touch, but that's what informed this whole thing. So again, other things have been overlooked because of this drive to fulfill the curve. And I hope that we don't repeat this failure with climate change. Solar geoengineering through a pandemic lens looks bad because model simulations with these narrow metrics plus the emergency, you have unprecedented blanket, fairly crude, large scale interventions. No evaluation in terms of procedural, distributive, recognitive, or intergenerational justice, or the follow-on effects. I'm not saying that they were necessarily the wrong thing to do, but I would like some documentation, right? And so I think we need to call for that kind of documentation that these other things have been thought about. Stopgap measures with no clear end goal, scientific confusion from officials led to what we've talked about as the hallucinatory response. People are extremely confused about what the point of these measures are. They don't know if the virus is going to be gone or coming back or what. And I think it needs to be okay to question the assumptions in the models. And it needs to be a legitimate question if the cure is worse than the disease, because we need to be asking that for things like solar geoengineering and whatever other measures might be thrown at us. Carbon removal through a pandemic lens, we could talk about more about this. I think that we've talked a little bit about how this collapse brings up the chance for deeper discussion about what to do with the fossil fuel industry. Can there be, I mean, obviously jobs and well cleanup, but perhaps also carbon removal as a sector that comes out of fossil fuel industry in ways that provides jobs. Climate change writ large through a pandemic lens. This is from that radical magazine, The Economist. I'm sure the situation is a lot worse in terms of how the emergency situation leads to repressive politics. And so I'm concerned about that, power grabs by autocrats. I'm concerned, frankly, about if people are willing to have these emergency measures indefinitely, what that means for somebody suggesting solar geoengineering. It's really interesting that so many nations tried out the same things, even if they might not have been well suited. Definitely awful rollout in a lot of places. It's concerning how polarized the discussion has been. It's interesting and perhaps encouraging the spread of new norms on social media. And so I think there's an opportunity here, but especially taking into account that people care about lives lost and they want to do the right thing. I find really encouraging. But basically, I think this illustrates why climate emergency is a dangerous way of understanding things. And just about the reopen protests, I've tried to talk to people at them. I think that I think we have to be really concerned about judging what's going on based on images we see circulating in the media. And I'm sure there's a ton of awful stuff going on, but I also think there's this group of people that is extremely confused about the science because it hasn't been well conveyed, that is watching some of the things they care about disappear or at least become uncertain. And that is in tune with these protests because they haven't seen what else is possible, and that we need to be attempting more strongly to reach some of these people that are reachable. So I know that's a lot, and I thank you for listening to all that.
All right, that was awesome. came through with the graphs. So, thanks to all the speakers for talking through your various positions. And I want to ask one question of my own before I start taking Q&A questions from folks who are watching. And I'll take this opportunity to again remind anyone who's watching, feel free to submit questions that you have for any or all of the speakers. But I just wanted quickly if each of the speakers could talk a little bit about the who they're imagining. And I think Nick did this maybe most explicitly, but you're talking about different dimensions of political problems. So how the science is being produced, how fossil fuel companies are not being challenged, but there are a variety of kinds of organizations or, you know, forms of solidarity or forms of institutions that might fit the bill for how you want to challenge those problems that you pointed out. So is it unions that you're thinking of primarily? Is it water protectors? Is it socialist organizations? Is it debtors unions? Is it something else? Who, for the things that you talked about, are you primarily addressing as for like who would take the concrete steps in the issue areas you're thinking about? And maybe if just to pick an order at random, maybe you can just go in reverse order. So Holly, that would be you first.
I mean, up to this point, I've thought of scientists doing my research as a point of intervention. I'm not sure if that's the best point necessarily. I think that for a lot of these questions, especially around the transition of the fossil fuel industry, obviously the unions working in that space, some of them who are already very involved with like the carbon capture coalition, for example, but to have that engagement be more direct and take it further is key. I also think that there's a lot of climate policy people who now, because of the oil price collapse, can be pushed in more radical directions.
So next up would be Geoff.
Okay, I think I did it that time. I think it's a great question. I mean, and one we should probably be asking ourselves over and over. I think in my own head, when I was speaking, I'm addressing the largely, but not only, community-based organizations, that the kind of organizations that I'm involved in, and we all probably are, where we live, but also, organizations that reach beyond the sort of geographical scale of our local lives too. Certainly, so for example, like here in BC, we have our organization called the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives that's been doing awesome work for 25 years almost. On a whole bunch of fronts, climate being one of them, but social justice more generally, health, childcare, you name it. And they're a really interesting group, and there are groups like them all over the place because they serve as a kind of network hub for the local labor movement, other community groups, the people fighting for affordable childcare, all this kind of stuff. And so their audience is broad. It's a in the most general sense of the term, a progressive audience, but it's a very broad-based audience that has, I think, has a real appetite to hear about coordinating struggles, coordinating conversations, coordinating pretty much anything, because each of those efforts on their own, it can often end up quite isolated. And so the who for me is folks like me and you, mostly. Not so much politicians or scientists, though of course, if powerful people were on board, that'd be helpful.
Awesome, thanks, Geoff. Nick?
Yeah, so I guess my talk was more geared towards people who would, tune into a live stream of Red May. So that's the short answer. But I would say though, in general, we do, there's kind of this like public facing front of the Red Nation. Sadly, it's attached to my image more so than the actual like leadership of the organization, which tends to be non-men, queer, indigenous women. And so that's something that like, that we should be up front with, that the Red Nation is, we're a queer indigenous socialist organization, which means a lot of things, but in general, we've established relationships with the National Nurses Union, or National Nurses United, I mean. We also, we work, like the Red Deal itself wasn't written by academics. It was actually written by a lot of working class people, and even some scientists. We have scientists, indigenous people are scientists, like they actually, we have engineers who work in solar technology who are very critical of the transition to green capitalism. So if you go and read the Red Deal, you'll actually see a lot of those criticisms. The other part that, I just want to emphasize that I brought up in my talk is that like this idea that indigenous people are not a universal, that we're just some kind of like interest group or whatever, is just really, it's always fascinating to me, because this document itself is actually a very universal document, and it actually arose from a series of discussions that we held in communities where there isn't a lot of like so-called left, thoughts. We had several, I presented it at my, like I went to a church. I don't go to church, I'm not a Christian, but I went to a church in my home community and presented it. And the council members, overwhelmingly that attended like agreed, and they tend to be, conservative politically, but they agreed like with the premises of it. So, that's important to think about, but also a place like South Dakota, when there is no kind of like alternative to the Republican Party or the just flagrant kind of like right-wing extremism, or even the conspiracies that Holly had brought up, like that's all it is, conspiratorial kind of like hallucinatory thinking. And believe it or not, like the thing with Trump is he's not invested in the truth. People like try to catch him on the lie. He's like a professional bullshitter. He's not invested at all in like being called a liar. It doesn't faze him. And so we have to think of a strategy that's like actually appealing to like working people. And so like in a place like South Dakota, there was this pork plant in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, where there was over 500 COVID cases because the governor refused to shut down, these businesses. And, the assumption is like, oh, we have to reach out to white workers. But if you know anything about these pork plants, most of them are migrant workers, undocumented workers, and people who like are not watching, Fox News or getting their news from what is that, InfoWars or whatever. So there is a need, and the South Dakota is an anti-union state, and there historically has been strong ties between unions and indigenous, treaty rights activists in the state itself. Like the gold mining union in the Black Hills actually allied itself with the Lakota Treaty Council back in 1980. I think 1980 actually. I actually met one of the guys who's now working for the National Nurses Union of all places. So those ties exist, and it's important to strengthen them. And actually, it's important to like think about indigenous people as workers, because a lot of us are like, working class people. But then also to think about mutual aid as a form of labor and work as well, that like, for us, it's just kinship. We're relatives, and we have these structures that we tap into. So care work is something that, thinking outside of the realm of like the so-called like productive sphere into the realm of like the informal economies that exist. A lot of our people like didn't even have jobs before this pandemic. And so like, it's important to remember that those things exist. And that's, that's really our base. That's, the base of people that we work with: care workers, teachers, working class people, anyone from scientists. So we need that kind of broad kind of class-based struggle. So that's kind of my audience, I guess.
Awesome. And Thea.
Yeah, I feel like I mean, Nick, some of the things that Nick just said are things that I was thinking. And, my first thought when you listed all of those different social groups is like, all of them. I mean, not per se that I think I'm speaking to all of them, or I'm trying to interpolate myself into all of those struggles, which would be inaccurate. But I definitely, when I think about like how to win an eco-socialist Green New Deal, how to win these transformations that we've been talking about, I just think about all of these disparate social struggles having such an important role, right? And good friend and co-author, my co-author Daniel Aldana Cohen, has done a lot of work on thinking of like movements for affordable housing specifically in the places that he's working in, Sao Paulo and New York City, as movements for a low carbon world. So movements that are demanding housing justice are demanding actually like the type of world that we think about when we think about eco-socialism, movements that are demanding mass transit and free transit are also like in the struggle for eco-socialism. They may not call themselves eco-socialists. They may not call themselves, like we're trying to reduce the climate emissions and refer to curves like the ones that Holly was, but they are, by the nature of a movement that is demanding mass transit over individualized transit, they are, fighting for a low carbon world. I think of the same thing in terms of care work, and, Nick almost took the words out of my mouth, that those struggles of care workers and for a care-centric society are struggles for like a really radical social transformation, whether or not they always use explicitly ideological language, though increasingly those militant sectors of the labor movement do use pretty, I would say, radical language to describe what type of world they want to build. It's not just about wages and benefits. It's a world where care for elders, care for the sick, care for the vulnerable is actually socially valued, right? Which is, I think, central to what we've been talking about. Rent strikers and people that don't want to pay their utility bills, like those are part of the eco-social struggle for me, right? I think those things should be decommodified, rent, housing, and essential services like utilities. So, again, whether or not the language is always explicit, I think like we should think of all of these people as comrades. And then I think within that, think about what is the role of more explicitly ideological organizations, right? So Red Nation has been mentioned, DSA has been mentioned, and there are certainly others. We won't go down the whole laundry list of explicitly left-wing organizations out there that are revolutionary, that are socialist, that are communist, and that are anarchist, but I think those types of formations have a really important role in interacting, in allying with, and doing solidarity work with, and in many cases, their own members being having a direct role in these struggles, right? And I think, explicitly ideological work has the task of, political education, of sort of connecting various struggles, of lifting them up, amplifying them, but also imparting a more directly political analysis to them. So I think there are tensions there. I don't want to simplify things and say it's all like rosy, but I think that there is like a clear role for explicitly ideologically defined organizations in this broader milieu of social struggles that don't always explicitly define themselves in environmental, climate, or sort of low carbon terms, but are, I think, fighting for a world that would be both more democratic, egalitarian, and also more environmentally sustainable.
Awesome. So now I'm going to turn to questions from the audience. So here's a broad one that's a good start. So this one's directed at Thea, but I think other people could potentially chime in. Well, of course, other people could chime in, but it connects to things that other people have said. So Thea brought up democratization as a core component to the Green New Deal proposal. And democracy is a term that can feel vague to people. So what are the institutional dimensions of socialist democracy as you're seeing it? And how does democratization kind of unfold as an institutional critique of capital and the political dimensions of a world structured by capital?
That's such a great question. That's such a big question. I'll just say a few things. I'm actually really curious what other folks have to say. And in a way, this kind of came up in something that Geoff said about not relying on, institutions like Supreme Courts, and how it's problematic that we kind of do in some cases have to rely on them to enforce, things like, ending a pipeline or mining project. But I'll let him speak to that if he wants to. For me, democracy isn't the liberal idea of like, we vote to elect other people, though that could be, you know, representation and delegation could play a role in a more socialist vision of democracy. But for me, democracy is first and foremost about collective control. Like, it's about controlling collectively the conditions of our socio-natural existence. And democratization as a kind of ongoing process. I don't think democracy is like an end goal. It's like a process that unfolds. Democratization is about struggles that subject more and more of social and economic life to collective control by those who are affected, and by those that, you know, are affected by the outcomes, right? So, you know, and I think that, you know, Nick, if he wants to talk about this more, but like indigenous notions of sovereignty and of like demanding clear consent and things like that, it's thinking about, you know, who is affected by a decision, and the people that are affected by a decision or by a process or an outcome or an activity should have decision-making power in that arena. And it's a similar notion to what, you know, worker control might look like in a workplace, but expanding that beyond just a workplace and thinking about what forms of collective community control would look like. And, you know, that raises all sorts of questions which are posed in the question about like what type of institutions and what type of practices could enact this. And I like to think about this as something that can happen at multiple scales. Like, what I said so far might sound like it could only work in a hyper-localized way, but I actually don't think that's true. A lot of my work has been focused on Latin America, where I think there's some of the most inspiring visions of what participatory democracy looks like. And some of it is super localized, but some of it goes all the way to envisioning new regional forms of cooperation, like in the global South, right? So I think that, you know, we can think about how scales interact, but I guess, you know, just to reiterate, it's about collective control over, you know, the world that we live in, and about thinking about what, you know, arenas we can enact that, and how to institutionalize that, but with an understanding that it's not like a set end goal. It's a process that inevitably involves kind of struggle and kind of unfolding. But I'll end it there and see what others have to say.
I guess I'll take a stab. A word like democracy is actually really vague, and it's hard to like win people over with abstract ideas, even like capitalism, you know, or settler colonialism. Like, what do those terms actually mean? And I think what we see in this moment in time is that we actually see some of the most robust forms of democracy emerging, or as an organic response to the crisis, whether it's climate change or even just the pandemic itself. So going back to a point that I made earlier about mutual aid, you know, mutual aid is an organic response from primarily colonized and communities of color, because, you know, we've always been like, you know, the joke goes is that, you know, when the United States introduced democracy, quote unquote, to these shores, like, we were the majority and they were the minority. And now they're the majority and we're the minority, and they're, you know, having us exalt the highest forms of democracy. But I think there are like actual concrete examples, and not just thinking about like, you know, this in an abstract way, but we have to look to the socialist kind of projects that do exist, like in the MST or the landless workers movement in Brazil, or to the communes in Venezuela. I actually got to visit one, and actually these are the things that we're trying to build as the Red Nation. And actually this pandemic has provided us the opportunity to begin to enact and to strengthen our food sovereignty programs. We do feed our people. We try to feed them as much as we can. And we're not talking about like, you know, food bank canned food, right, that a lot of our people are getting on the streets. We're talking about actual like appropriate, like traditional food that belongs to us, that's reflective of our culture and who we are. So we cook, you know, if you ever come to our conference, Cleo's Blue Corn Kitchen is gonna like feed you really well. So I'm just putting that out there. When we have it in person, we fed over 350 people for each meal, and that included like hand-picked blue corn mush, you know, so we had the veggie variety, but then there was also mutton and chilies and things like that. But so right now, what we're talking about, like when we're talking about democracy, we actually have to also democratize the means of production, and that's the process that we're undergoing right now. And as much as it's important to engage in kind of the elections and, you know, these electoral campaigns, we actually need to be sowing the seeds of long-term struggle and sowing the seeds of food sovereignty and digging the fields to plow for the communes to come. Because if we're producing our own food, and like a lot of people are like, you know, against the dual power approach or whatever, I don't really care. That's an abstract debate to me. What I can see in front of me is I can see that indigenous people have a knowledge and culture that was actually created from a non-capitalist society that we still retain, even though it's, you know, it's not like perfectly fully fledged, whereas like an entire like invasive society has been introduced with no kind of like remnants of a communal or collective way of living. So if we take Meriategui seriously, you know, he talks about the social myth of indigenous or Indo-communism or Indo-socialism. That's something that's being taken seriously in Latin America, in North America, like I guess north of Mexico. It's not being taken seriously at all. And we're not going to wait for people. We're not trying to like convince anybody like on the left that this is something that we need to do. We take our lead from, you know, organizations like Cooperation Jackson and actually get out there and enact our politics as much as we fight for the streets.
Thanks a lot. Geoff or Holly, do you have anything to add to this first question? All right, so I'll move on to question 2, which is directed at Holly, but again, anyone who has something to say should feel free to say it. So the question 2, they are asking, Holly, it's not clear to me, what is the hallucinatory response to the modeling and narrative of what you call, quote, governing on the curve, unquote? What are the other hallucinations of political economy revealed through state and social responses to the pandemic?
Yeah, that was just a turn of phrase I picked up tonight from the conversation here. And it was referring to Trump's kind of strategy of powering through this crisis by exerting his hallucination onto this large group of people, if I can badly paraphrase what was discussed. And so I don't think that's actually directly connected to the governing the curve. The reason I'm concerned about it is I could see a similar dynamic coming with solar geoengineering in the future if there was an emergency situation, in which case this became the answer. And then there was a leader that was charismatic and had some bizarre Twitter power to draw everybody into that sphere, you know? So yeah, I hope that answers it.
Gotcha. So just kind of pushing on this hallucinatory response framework for thinking about things, you know, I was struck by the interaction between that point and a point that Nick had made earlier in terms of, you know, there's a discourse about, you know, what kind of worker we need to protect, and we need to, you know, protect the presumptively white working class of these meatpacking plants, or, you know, at least US citizen documented class. But if you look at who's actually working under the conditions that we're talking about, it's a whole other group of people, largely migrant workers, so on and so forth. And one thing that I think looms in the background of things all 4 of you have been saying, but maybe is worth talking a little bit explicitly about, is this whole fake news, misinformation kind of element to both climate change in a much longer view, and of course, COVID-19 in a much shorter view. So if I could just ask folks, is that something that you're particularly worried about in your issue areas? Do you think that, is that something you're particularly worried about for whatever issues you were talking about? Or do you think that the kinds of movements we're hopefully in the process of building are going to be robust against these kinds of challenges?
I'll say something brief on that note. It's such a good question. I'm on the one hand, obviously, there's a lot of misinformation propagated intentionally, and I'll come back to that in a second. But on the other hand, it doesn't always seem to be so effective. I mean, right now we have like, I think someone else said this earlier, like 70% of people in the US supposedly like believe that, we should, abide by social distancing. So like these right-wing protests and then like the misinformation coming from Trump and from Fox News, I'm sure, I don't watch it, but I'm sure it's, all over the place, like are not per se affecting how most people are thinking, and most people are not represented in these super violent settler colonialist, protests that Nick initially described earlier. And so, there's that piece. There's also my discomfort with focusing exclusively on misinformation and fake news, because it has this tendency, and I think this goes to many things that Holly was saying earlier, it has this tendency to just like valorize expertise as like a neutral thing and like a depoliticized thing. And actually my comrade in the Eco-socialist working group, Matt Hogan on Twitter earlier, like made this point, which I just think is a point just always worth repeating, that like science isn't neutral. There's also scientific disagreement, which is not the same thing as saying that climate change doesn't exist, but it is the same thing as saying that like, science in some neutral monolithic sense is not going to save us. Like there are scientists that work with petrochemical, like there are all sorts of scientists out there and they're not all good and on our side. So I think that the liberal kind of hashtag resistance, like valorization of expertise is I don't think is where we should pin our hopes. And then I guess that the last thing, and this is like perhaps really an obvious point to everyone on the panel, but when I had this realization, it was new to me, which is like how to think about climate denial. I think that I always thought that climate denial meant that like right-wing people or industry actors or whatever, like didn't believe in the science of climate change. Like it was almost like I interpreted them in good faith. Like they literally just don't believe it. They don't understand it. They're missiled. They don't get it. And they propagate this denial. But that's so obviously not what it is. I mean, I was like, whatever, kind of duped in a way by thinking about it that way, which is the liberal way to think about it. Like, oh, they just don't get it or something. But I was listening to actually Naomi Klein, I think, on my partner's podcast, The Dig. And like, she like made this really clear point that like climate denial is actually about understanding very deeply what the science says. It's about understanding that like, the science says that capitalism as it exists is completely unsustainable. And so in order to like fend off the radical transformations that the science makes clear are like in accord with empirical reality, we need to deny the science. Like the denial is a positive political project to fend off radical transformation. It's not people on the right happen to just like not get empirical reality. It's actually like they get it all too well. It's like the eco-socialists and the barbarians like understand the reality, and they're on different sides of a political struggle. So those are like three kind of disconnected thoughts about the question of truth and fake news.
Yeah, that third point really resonates with me, but all three were important. What do other folks think about this?
I could chime in. I've definitely thought a lot about this. I think what Thea just said points to, there's a couple different levels of misinformation, right? On one hand, you have this level that Thea was just talking about these fossil fuel industry interests who are putting out climate denial because they know about climate change, because they've been studying it for decades and causing it for decades, and very targeted, information war, basically. I think also about the ways different actors have exploited our media ecosystem, creating fake protests, stuff like that. Documented in the Mueller report and elsewhere. And so there's definitely one way there's a strategy that somehow has to figure out how to confront those types of actors. But then there's also just people that create or share misinformation in a really haphazard layperson way without that targeted thing. So climate deniers that you meet, people in red states that I interview who are climate deniers, but not like the fossil fuel companies are climate deniers, right? And that demands another approach. And I think what I'm most worried about is the platforms we have are, you know, algorithmically designed to make things worse. And so how can we even confront it on these particular platforms? I'm really daunted. I don't know what we're going to do.
Awesome. Geoff or Nick, want to speak on this one? Otherwise, we have another question if we want to pivot to that. Yeah, okay. So,
Hear me?
yep.
Okay, cool. I only want to say something very briefly because I think Thea and Holly covered everything better than I could have. The only thing I wanted to say that I think about a fair bit are problems of, I think, what would be loosely called ideology. And part of those are just a function of, you know, living in the kind of messed up capitalist variation that we do, at least in North America. You know, so for example, looking at those some of the protesters against the lockdowns or the physical distancing that we're experiencing right now, those protests have happened here in Vancouver too, and across Canada, always again small numbers. But you often hear them or see signs saying that those people associate the existing, you know, public health mechanisms as communist or authoritarian. For many people, those two things are very close to synonyms. And I don't think it does, at least the folks that I've spoken to, it certainly doesn't help me get the conversation or debate going any further if I just tell them they're wrong and they've misunderstood what communism actually is. It's really this liberatory process that was, you know, it was never represented by the so-called communist states. People stopped listening 3 words into that proposition. For them, this is much closer to a truth than I, at least, am willing to admit. And tackling that problem requires a different kind of approach. I think that touches on some of the stuff that Thea and Holly have said. It's not about, as Thea said, just explaining true communism to them and then they walk away, I'll put down their sign and join me. It never happens that way. It's a much bigger and longer process, I think. You know, the kind of thing that anyone who self-identifies with the left runs into every day. And I'm not exactly sure what the right strategy is, but I definitely think that kind of thing happens to me almost daily.
Yeah, what I find fascinating, just to like build off of what everyone has already said, is that there is an increased media attention around these protests, but there's a decreased media attention. There's no media attention around the historic number of strikes that have taken place, right? And it's a completely lopsided view. And if you think of the Trump phenomenon, Trump like had a small campaign budget, but he was given so much airtime, right? Because of the corporate media's, you know, like it's a profit-driven media. It's selling a commodity. It doesn't care. It's not, you know, yes, it's a kind of ideological arm of the ruling class, right? To reproduce the interests of the ruling class in a very kind of like Marxian sense. But, you know, like I think what I've been challenged to do as a writer, as somebody who's an organizer, is that we actually have to, you know, we're here as socialists and communists to produce not commodities of writing and, you know, media, and like some of us, you know, work with podcasts and things like that, but actually to produce confidence to change things, right? And in these certain situations, and even like with simple things such as like, you know, social distancing and PPE. That was the first conversation I often had with people like in our community, and the people we organize with, was about coronavirus. And so it was a moment to have a political conversation as well, because they were like, I probably shouldn't go to work. And it's like, yeah, we should probably not go to work. And how can we organize to like not go to work? And how can we? And so that was the conversation. So we cede so much ground to the right on these things, but also we have to realize that like the majority of the population in the United States doesn't even engage in what we would consider formal politics, and they don't vote. And we're always concerned about this other side. There's always going to be this side, you know, it's always going to be loud, it's going to be violent, it's going to be ugly. But we're here to build, and I think even as somebody speaking on behalf of the Red Nation in a leadership position, our strategy right now is to actually build the left in this moment in time, and I think that should be the strategy. Whatever our political and ideological differences are, we have to build a left to survive.
I think that's a great transition into another question that was DM'd to me on Twitter by a comrade. They said, can you ask Nick about strategies to renew the call for climate debt repayments when third world solidarity has been diluted by authoritarian regimes? Perhaps whether agreeing to demilitarization campaigns in places like Palestine and Kashmir and US responses to Indian resistance, maybe that can be made a prerequisite for building an internationalist climate solidarity movement. Also linked to the latter, how do we organize against fast increasing criminalization and surveillance?
Those are really great questions. And I just want to go back to the question of Venezuela, because I was there last October for an indigenous peoples gathering, and there was this beautiful Kenyan grandmother who was there, indigenous woman, who talked about, she's like, I've been saying, she's in her her twilight years, but she was like, I've been traveling the United States for over half a century saying the exact same thing, that the United States is standing in the way of everyone else's liberation. And this is the US population is the most heavily propagandized population in the world. And I think it's important to remember that, and to Holly's point, to grant them some, some credit, like, and some leeway in when we engage these conversations. And so when we talk about authoritarianism, it's always racialized, right? Right now it's China, like it's China, Chinese people are authoritarian, they're the one that brought the virus, but never, like this government is authoritarian. The definition of Indian relations in this country is authoritarian. We don't elect the Secretary of Interior, even though the Secretary of Interior attempted to terminate a tribe in the middle of a pandemic. And if you think about the Department of the Interior, we're the only human population, the only human demographic in this country that has its human services in a department next to wildlife and natural resource management. Think about that. If you want to talk to me about authoritarian, we can sit down and we'll have an entire 500-year discussion about it. But I think it does lend itself to actually talking about like what is happening in places like Palestine and Kashmir, because oftentimes those two places, those two geographies don't get talked about when we talk about like the climate justice. And in fact, if you think about the Gaza Strip was supposed to be unlivable by this year, right? 2020, and now it's like this open air prison camp. But there's also an attempt by Israel now to develop offshore oil and gas in this particular region. So there is a connection there, but there's also the larger kind of security state apparatus that we can see being built was actually being talked about by the so-called intelligence community in the United States, as early as a decade ago, when they were saying that there was the threat multiplier of climate refugees. So they're directly related. The intelligence community has already believed, as Thea pointed out very eloquently, already believed in climate change because they see increased migration. So the response to it is actually increased border security and the criminalization of migrants and the other. And so this the last part of the question was also linked to the latter. How do we organize against fast increasing criminalization and surveillance? We can't say that the migrant justice movement is separate from the climate justice movement. It's like this question of how do we bring all these people together and talk? It's like it's actually just one. It's just one movement. But if we center the question of migrants, we begin to open up a whole new series of questions in how we understand something like climate debt, right? The fact that people are migrating from these places has everything to do with the imperialist policies of the United States. And so the sanctions against Venezuela are targeting the largest oil reserve in the world, right? To prevent them from taking the path of resource development. The coup in Bolivia, some would argue that it was related to the development and the potential nationalization, not just of their gas reserves, but of their lithium reserves, which would be used ostensibly in, you know, rechargeable batteries for electric cars and things like that, and so-called green technology. So climate debt also means what Thea brought up earlier is technology transfers to these countries, right? And it's interesting now, you know, this is a whole different conversation. We're running out of time, but for the first time in, you know, in a long time, a country other than the United States, China, has filed more patents. You know, so like there's a shift happening, right? And we have to be really attentive to this. But you know, it doesn't take off our attention as people who are living in the belly of the beast. Even if you're in Canada, right? If you're living in the belly of the beast, your primary responsibility is to stop imperialism at home.
Awesome. I want to thank our speakers here I've learned a shit ton over the last couple hours, and this has been dope, but I can't let us leave without answering at least one what is to be done question. So thankfully, somebody from, I believe, the YouTube asked a question that fits the bill. They asked, I'm wondering what the technical compositions of your approaches entail for socialist and communist responses to the multiplicity of ecological crises converging across the planet today. What are the real technical and practical directives for the left? So I think it's just a larger version of that last point about surveillance. But if we're thinking about the convergence of wildfires and so on and so forth, right? So who wants to go first? Holly.
I mean, I'm not sure about the word technical here. Honestly, what's on my mind is probably really lame. I am really concerned about the backlash to what's going on with the pandemic and what seems to be a strong likelihood that it gets Trump reelected, which makes stuff harder. I'm not saying Biden is great, he sucks, but I think everything is much harder with more Trump because of the decay of our institutions. And so I'm very concerned with finding a posture on managing the pandemic that is worker-centered, that protects vulnerable people, and that doesn't sound to people out there like the left or liberals or whoever wants to keep you locked in your house until there's a techno-fix vaccine, because I think that's a dead end. So we need to have another concept. We need to organize around it and use it to bring people in and help them see that, you know, the crisis is not the pandemic, the crisis is capitalism. And right now with the dynamic that's out there, that conversation isn't happening. So that's what I've got.
I'll just say really quickly that I'm so glad you said that, Holly. I like 100% agree with you. My biggest pet peeve right now is like, you know, though there is a more positive way to spin it that you did earlier, which was interesting, because my pet peeve has recently been this kind of social distancing Karen kind of thing on the internet, like just people criticizing other people for not socially distancing. And you had like an interesting way to kind of recover that more positively, that we can see a kind of motivation around care kind of underlying that. But I think that what you just said now speaks to my annoyance with that approach, which is like people already feel isolated and feel unable to kind of like do the right thing and don't know how to do the right thing for all the reasons you said earlier, and just kind of yelling at people is very individualizing. And so I think that like exactly what you said, like if we can have a message that's not like being pedantic about like what you should or shouldn't be doing, but rather saying like we deserve a society in which we're all cared for, and like where we have the resources to do what we need to do to keep distant, you know, if that's needed, or so long as that's needed. And I just want to reiterate that I love your last comment, and I think that's, you know, what socialists should be kind of bringing to the table in terms of our response.
Well, that sounds like a good moment to I won't say end this discussion because it goes on, and there's really so much more to talk about. I, for one, would love to talk about the use of the curve as a narrative, which opens a lot of fascinating notions. But maybe we can save that one for Sunday, Geoff, when we do speculative finance, speculative fiction, your whole piece and viewpoint, which is rational expectations, which is essentially about how people kind of model as an equilibrium curve something that in fact isn't empirically. You might be able to use that angle to talk about mathematical fictions as substitutes for a narrative of how the economy really works and how businesses go after money or choose to invest, as opposed to these strange structures that, quote, Nobel Prize winning economists give us. But we do have to stop. I hope the discussion will continue. And we're lucky to have almost everybody here on another panel. Oh, Thea, this is your second. We won't be seeing you again this year, but Femi, you're on a philosophy panel on the pandemic, and Nick is on the age of circulation struggle with Joshua Clover, Glenn Coulthard, and Geoff, as I said, on the speculative finance, speculative fiction. Tomorrow night, we have racial capitalism and disposable populations in the time of COVID-19. That's at 5 p.m. So last, again, I'll go back to money. I won't harp on it. I won't say the word money again and again, money, money, money. I won't do that. But I would like to encourage you to reach in your pockets, bring out those credit cards and go to our website, click on donate, or go to the bottom of this YouTube description. We need money to continue. And so with those dull words to a conversation that took wings for much of the evening, I bid you all good night from Red May, and stay healthy.
Thank you.